sometimes students feel that they're just another number or a cog in, in the system, and they're not listened to as individuals. In my practice, I always try, my best to treat each individual advisee as an individual. I think, the importance of having a sort of culture of compassion and care for students and regard is really important. Because again, if students feel cared for, that you feel like your advisor is invested in your journey as a student, as an individual, they're more likely again to disclose issues that they might be facing. Perhaps sometimes it's our fault as well as advisors, because if we're not being open and as approachable as we should hopefully aim to be, then students can feel reluctant as well to come to us for these type of issues.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Unfiltered by Empowered. This is a podcast where we have unfiltered conversations with educators and professionals from around the globe. I'm your host, Anshul Lau, and in our podcast, we explore the real stories, ideas, challenges, and innovation shaping the education today. Through these conversations, we aim to celebrate good practice, share honest reflections, and inspire listeners from across the sector. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Wayne, who's a senior tutor and school academic advisor at the University of Manchester. Wayne recently also joined us in one of our webinars, and I'm really pleased to now continue the conversation with him in a more reflective podcast space. And in this episode, we will be exploring the vital role of academic advising and fostering student success and institutional flourishing, with particular focus on professional advising model being developed within the School of Social Sciences at the University of Manchester. We will also touch upon how advising can support the development of the whole student, empower decision making, cultivate student agency, and nurture both personal and academic growth. Wayne, it is a real pleasure to have you with us today. And to begin with, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your journey into academic advising, and what drew you to this area of work particularly?
Well, thank you very much, Anshul, for this invitation. It's a real pleasure to be part of this fantastic podcast series. And of course, to have presented as part of the webinar series, Community of Practice, several weeks ago. So thank you very much again for this wonderful platform. Just to give an overview really of my background. So essentially, I was drawn to law in particular because I was involved as a legal assistant from December of 2009 until June of 2015 in a case that involved medical negligence against the Irish state. And it's actually something that was very close to home because it involved my mother, who was one of the victims. So that's what spurred me really to pursue, the study of law at the University of Manchester. Fast forwarding a little bit, I then, after that, went to the University of Leeds. I was teaching there for several years across many core legal subjects. And alongside that role, I was also working as a policy assistant for a member of Parliament. So getting to see, a real impact and tangible examples, let's say, of, the sort of impact work can have, casework, for constituents who obviously are represented by the member of Parliament. And then again, forwarding to October of 2021, that's when I came into my current role as senior tutor and school advisor within the School of Social Sciences, specifically the Law and Economics departments at the University of Manchester. And really, that's where advising became much more prominent as part of my professional journey. Advising was always in the background, I would say, even when I was at Leeds, so when I was teaching principally. Some students in capacity as my tutees, so those who I teach, would come, for support or raise issues that they might have. But my role was not explicitly, student support and well-being, as it is now. The good thing, I think, in my current role, I have a sort of blended model. So I do have, engage in frontline advising for students or advisees, but I also teach as well on some of the core law modules and also in the economics department. So I teach on the public law module, and I also teach as a lecturer on the public law and economics field as part of a module called Power and Value. So really, it's a blended role, I would say.
Oh, wow, you bring a very diverse experience and transition. And it's how do you do multitasking in one alongside your role? It must ask a lot of you and both the roles that you're having right now.
Well, absolutely, yes. I mean, teaching, as you will be aware, has quite intensive periods, so cycles.
Yeah.
Obviously, particularly around exam periods when you're engaged in marking. So that can be quite a challenge, when you're responsible for up to 200 advisees at the same time. So, it's quite a difficult balancing exercise, juggling a lot of competing demands and commitments. But I think I enjoy that challenge as well. I love, I love being busy and engaged in a diverse way in a lot of different activities. I think it keeps things interesting, keeps the development flowing, and so on.
Absolutely. And before we move further in the conversation, and for someone listening who may hear the term often but not fully grasp it, how do you define academic advising in its fullest sense?
So I think if you boil it down to its bare essence or bones, so to speak, it's about supporting students to develop a sense of self. This notion, as you mentioned at the beginning, of developing the whole student. So it's not just focusing explicitly or exclusively rather on academic things, but also the personal, developmental, what their individual goals are and how we can try to nurture that process, how we can help students to realize their objectives, aims, and goals. So I'd say a sort of, you can have a multiple approach, a multi-pronged approach to advising. In some cases, it might develop into coaching, for instance. So I do advise, I do also coach some of my advisees. In other cases, you might have to be more directive, where it's less goal-oriented and more, about resolving particular issues. So you have to adopt, I think, a variable approach based on your toolbox, if you will, that you have as an advisor.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched upon coaching also. I think when you're working with students, it's a two-way process. So has there been a moment where students taught you something that changed how you think about advising in your role? Is any coaching experience or any interaction that you might have had?
Yes, I would say definitely. So actually, as part of my role, but it's something external to it, but I'm actually one of the coaches for it's called the Manchester Momentum coaching scheme. And that's aimed at, widening participation students, typically those who are, less likely to achieve a good degree outcome. So below a 2-1 essentially. And, as part of that process, we've had formal training by GRIT, which is an external organization, a fantastic organization teaching coaches, how to be effective in their coaching practice. But I would say, the key thing I took away, I take away actually in my current practice is some students are willing to be coached. So there's a permission stage where students have to give permission to you as the coach, they as, of course, the coachee, to, engage in that sort of two-way process. Advising is a bit different because obviously, you're not necessarily, helping to achieve towards a particular goal. The questions you might ask as an advisor are perhaps different than what you would ask as a coach. And again, it's differentiated from mentorship. So, oftentimes I think these terms are all intermingled and obviously they're subtly distinct. But I think advising is more the general, holistic picture, and then coaching is really, a subset of advising methodology. That's the way I, think about it as a process. Probably, to compartmentalize and make things more easy to draw upon.
Yeah, and do you think when students come to you, I think they should understand and know what they need, or is it a part of your job helping them make sense of that?
So I think really it just depends upon the student that comes before
Okay.
you as an advisor. So some, if you're helping to resolve, let's say, a more administrative based issue, then that you
Okay.
can be more directive and signpost, perhaps to another professional services team. Um, if it's more goal oriented, so let's say they're looking for internships, work placements, usually that's a bit more independent. They have to do some research. Again, you can give some guidance, hints, and tips. You might, review their CV or cover letters, maybe help with a reflective approach to questions that they ask as part of
Yeah.
a process of applying for these things. But I think that's where students have to be a bit more, active in a
Yeah.
sense. So they have to actually research about, let's say, a law firm in my practice. So if a student comes to me and says, I'm really interested in, work experience with this particular law firm, then they do have to do some research. What areas of practice does that law firm specialize in? Is it something that's aligned to my, professional
Yeah.
aspirations? So I don't know if a student wants to pursue family law, then obviously they have to find a law firm that specializes in that field and
Yeah.
hopefully gain the experience and maybe shadow a solicitor,
Yeah.
and so on. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful to understand. I'm just keen to understand how much of advising is about asking the right questions rather than having the right answer.
So I think oftentimes, the way you pose questions to
Yeah.
students is important. So it shouldn't just be, closed type of questions, which is simple yes or no. It should be a bit more exploratory, in my opinion. So asking more open-ended style questions, giving students the ability to express themselves in a fuller sense. So sometimes, I ask students how they found the recent results, for example, from semester one. And some students might only respond with, "Oh, they're good. I did well." And then I like to
Yeah.
delve a bit deeper and say, well, what does that mean to you? What's good? What are you happy with? Are you achieving what you want to achieve? Does it align, for example, with where you want to go next? If you're planning, for example, to do postgraduate study,
Yeah.
these sort of things matching up. So I think it's about being a bit more exploratory.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily as well about having a particular answer, because I think the answers will differ depending on the individual that's before you. And I think that's something that's often lost
Yeah.
in practice. Sometimes students feel that they're just another number or a cog in
Yeah.
the system, and they're not listened to as individuals. In my practice, I always try, my best to treat each individual advisee as an individual, even though it sounds obviously so simple and so, common sense, really. But from a practical perspective, it can also be very challenging. Competing demands. If you have lots of
Yeah.
advisees, it's not always easy to view every individual, in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah.
But at least we strive towards that as practitioners and,
Yeah.
work
Yeah.
towards that as much as possible.
Yeah, absolutely. And how is a advisor assigned to a student? Is it depending on the query that they have? They are signposted to the right advisor. Do you hold a specific specialism in the team based on which a student reaches out to you? So how does it work?
So that's a really great question. So generally how it works, so I should have perhaps explained it earlier, but for this professional advising model at the
Yeah.
School of Social Sciences at the university, we are mainly or predominantly working with first year students.
Okay.
So roughly all the first years across the school are divided equally amongst 11 advisors. So I'm one of those as part of a team. But we have over time, given that we've been in these roles, coming up to 5 years, been connected to specific departments. So in my case, connected to law, specifically connected to economics. So we built up that expertise, familiarity with the programs, and become very specialized within within those programs. So we are allocated students or advisees really based on those programs. Not always working out, exactly like that, but by and large, it follows that sort of scheme. Um, and the question about specialisms is again a very good one. So in my case, I'm part of the School of Social Sciences Mitigating Circumstances Review Panel, so review complex cases related to mitigation. And I act as a point of contact not only for students across the school, as well as my advisees, of course, but equally as a point of contact for colleagues across the school. So I sometimes receive queries from colleagues in the law department. How might I approach this particular case or this advisee? What procedures should I go through? Even never mind for students, even sometimes for colleagues, these processes can be very obscure. Particularly where a student is new to an institution, and there's a lot of different processes for different issues. So, you have mitigation processes, you have academic appeals, you have, issues around submission of assessments, and all these things can be quite complex to navigate. As a newcomer, and that's also the same for colleagues as well. Those who might have just joined recently. It can take some time to get up to speed with how things work at an institutional or school level.
And even I was thinking that even for a student to seek advice from like a professional at a university, they need to build trust with them before they're opening about their mitigating circumstances or anything at all they might be seeking advice on. So what do you think students would value the most in an advisor when they have a good experience on advising?
So again, I think this is an excellent question because it builds upon what we've just discussed about the advisor-advisee relationship. And you're absolutely right. There has to be that mutual respect and trust between both sides. Because an advisee is only really going to disclose something that they might be going through if they feel that they can trust you as a person to confide in, essentially. So I think it's our responsibility as advisors to try and set up that atmosphere. So, for example, you have a private office space, you have a place where there's a door, you can close the door, setting up a private space. Obviously, you might be personable with the students as much as possible. So maintaining a professional, personal boundary at the same time, but equally, not just being like a machine in our behavior and response to students. Showing students actually we are the human side, not just institutional representatives, which we are, of course, but the institutional human face, of the institution. But actually showing we are actually, people, human beings, just as they are, of course, and meet them where you find them. And I think the importance of having a sort of culture of compassion and care for students and regard is really important. Because again, if students feel cared for, that you feel like your advisor is invested in your journey as a student, as an individual, they're more likely again to disclose issues that they might be facing. And obviously, it's not easy. When an advisee comes to you and says, I'm struggling with mental health issues. These are very complex issues. There's often a lot of stigma around it, and it can be very difficult to break down the barriers of communication. It's not always easy. I mean, we do in the school have a specialist wellbeing team, which is excellent, that we can signpost to. But then the other side of that is that students can sometimes feel that they're having to repeat, the same information to multiple actors. It obviously doesn't help. And they might trust you as an advisor, but not someone else that they don't know yet.
Absolutely.
So acting as a sort of bridge, between myself as an advisor and the professional services teams, that can help. And I really think that that's how I would describe my role more generally, is that, really we're a bridge to both sides. So bridging up the academic colleagues and the professional service colleagues to break down that divide.
Just to confirm on that, if basically you have met a student and they are seeking some advice again, so there are highly likely tendency or possibility that they'll be matched up with you, or they can still be matched up with somebody else. Do you think, if, based on your unavailability, you might be on annual leave, but they still need advice. So how would that setup work in that case?
So in our institution, it works on an ad hoc basis. So if let's say I'm on leave, like over the recent Easter period, then another colleague would be able to step in and cover essentially for urgent type of queries. But we always have the central services or the school-based services which are available on hand for any of those urgent, more urgent issues. And we do have a 24/7, mental health support line connected to the university.
That's good to know. And on that note, I would also like to understand, how do you think that higher education still tends to separate academic success from personal well-being too much? And if that is the case, how can advising help bridge that gap?
I think that's a very good reflective question, because I have seen, I've attended UCAT, the UK Advising and Tutoring Association conferences for the last several academic years. And I've seen from other higher education institutions, they do have that clear, bright line distinction between academic queries and pastoral issues. In our practice here at Manchester, actually, we combine them so that they're often interrelated, not really separable in that very strict sense. I mean, to me, it seems, to have that sort of strict separation doesn't really help, again, because it has that issue of having to repeat different things to different people. And, that's not necessarily the most accessible approach for students or advisees. So I think it's important really to view them as one and the same almost. So obviously, if the student is feeling good from a well-being perspective or is doing well, it's more likely the case they're going to be academically successful as well. So I think they're really inseparable in some sense. They're actually intertwined necessarily. So, and obviously we do want, advising is not just strictly about academics, it's also about, the individual well-being of the student as well. And we don't want students to be doing well academically, but then, personally they're suffering greatly, because that's not obviously achieving that whole or well-rounded student. So really it's about a balance, achieving a balance, a healthy balance.
So do you think, are there any aspects in the university culture that makes it harder for students to ask for help?
I think sometimes because of the, sorry.
No, I was just asking this because considering the size of university and the school that you might have, and you have 11 advisors in total. So do you get every student come out to reach out to you? Are they aware of that? And if not, then that's why I was thinking that, are there any aspects of university culture that makes it harder for students to understand the prospects or the bandwidth of the help you'll provide, and to even ask and reach out for help?
Yeah, well, I think it can be challenging from a process angle. Because obviously, as I mentioned before, if a new student is coming for the first time to university, unless they have very strong, background connections, it's unlikely they're going to be aware of, the entirety of the student experience and the systems in place. So it can be very difficult, I think, sometimes for students to, become familiar with all these different processes, which again, can be quite obscure in the beginning. And they need that sort of demystification by advisors. And that's where our role, I think, comes in. But I think sometimes, making things overly complex can be a real barrier for students to come. And really, it's about how you advertise it as well to students. So I know here at Manchester, they are, being very versatile and adapting to social media. modern forms of communication. So that I
Okay.
know, for example, there's an Instagram page where stories are posted about go and meet your advisor. This is the welcome
Yeah.
week. Go and make sure you attend these sessions with your advisor. Or it could be look at the well-being services that are on offer, and
Yeah.
there's certain drop-ins. So again, these are advertised. There might be other events. So recently, I ran and led across the school. They were called writing support drop-ins. And again, these were advertised via social media to help students on specific themes across the school. So I think these sort of initiatives help to break down those barriers. And
Yeah.
obviously, we know now that social media is becoming much more important, and how we advertise, even as an institution internally to our students, is very important.
Yeah.
And obviously, we want to encourage them to engage with us as much as we possibly can.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned that there are certain different channels where students are reached out. And overall, have you noticed any particular assumption that students make about who this advising service is for? Do the students feel that it is only for those students who might be in crisis, do you think?
Yes, sometimes. So for my advising practice, we hear from students that they felt, oh, I wasn't sure whether to come to you as an advisor about this particular issue
Yeah.
because he wasn't sure it was in our remit. So there's still sometimes that mindset, I think, from students that advisors can only help me academically. They can't help me
Yeah.
personally. So that's something we work hard at the very beginning, to in our initial group meetings, small group meetings, to try and really set out clearly what our role is. So it includes, in our case, for example, academic queries, pastoral, so personal issues, as well as employability, which is a constant thread and
Yeah.
theme, which is becoming much more important and prominent. So yeah, I think it's about just making sure it's as clear as possible to students, because students sometimes think, if they're going through a personal crisis, my advisor might not be the best person to go to.
Yeah.
And perhaps sometimes it's our fault as well as advisors, because if we're not being open and as approachable as we should hopefully aim to be, then students can feel reluctant as well to come to us for these type of
Yeah.
issues. But I think it's important to have a program presence as well. So I mentioned
Yeah.
earlier, I teach in the law department,
Yeah.
and obviously have advisees in the law department. So sometimes there's a confluence between advisees and students that I teach, which I think helps, again, break down the barriers. So if I teach a student in public law, they can
Yeah.
see me, as part of the law department, but then also as their advisor, they can come to me. So I think that can help sometimes as well, to having a
Yeah.
program presence, to help not only academically, but obviously,
Yeah.
personally, pastorally as well.
Yeah, and you even mentioned that some students might be reluctant to reach out for support. So, to what extent do you think language matter in advising? The words institution or advisors might use, the tone of their emails, the way support is being framed, does it have any impact at all?
So yeah, I think essentially that the way the way we advertise our services to students needs to be made much more accessible. Again, it's not always clear, um, and students we need to work on that in terms of having simplifying our messages essentially to students, so they're more accessible, more easy to navigate. And I think the way we speak to students, the way we interact with them, the way we communicate, obviously has a big impact as well. Um, so keeping things, as I said before, professional on the one side, but equally also being personable on the other, because you can be both at the same time. Sometimes I think, again, as advisors, we have this mindset of, to be professional, we have to be almost distant in a
Yeah.
sense. And that can come across as a bit cold and not really a warm for being in such a supportive role for students.
Yeah.
Um, But actually, I think being professional doesn't mean being distant. It actually means being, being able to help students, and obviously deal with them on a personal basis. So treat them as individuals, treat them again with care, compassion. And recently, from my experience again at UCAT and across the institution, so at Manchester, there's been this great drive towards compassionate communications.
Okay.
So again, trying to instill compassion even, when we speak to students. So I can recall an example now of when we, had a bit of a cyber incident at the university several years ago, and a student had reached out, in a quite an anxious state about their data, etc. And they had felt until they had, reached out to me that they were just being treated as another number in the system. And I think that's, quite unfortunate. And, it's important that students are essentially heard and feel that they're heard. And I think that's a skill as well, which is developed as a sort of advisor, and something that perhaps all higher education institutions can, hopefully keep improving and working on.
Yeah, and even earlier you mentioned, like, we have been discussing professional model. So what actually is this professional model? How is it different to a normal model at like university, like students advice center, student support services have been there in education and higher education from decades. But how is the professional model at University of Manchester on ground different to any other model in existence?
So again, this is a great question. So I think the professional model at the moment in the UK is rather underutilized. I think it's gaining some popularity, but you're right that the more traditional models, so we have the pastoral model, where it's only academic colleagues who advise students. And then you have also the integrated archetype in some institutions. So that's where, for example, there might be certain thematic workshops which are led by an advisor, who is also a member of that particular school or department. The professional model, in distinct contradistinction to those two, really, at least here at Manchester, has a sort of blended approach. So we do have some academic colleagues who advise, so from the second and third year. And then obviously the professional advisors really are staying with only the first years. So for every new first year cohort that comes in, they have the professional advisor, and then subsequently they are arranged according to their program and have academic colleagues. So again, I think it comes back to that point around trying to build bridges and links. Professional advising on the one side, and then obviously complemented with academic colleagues who are also advisors. And that's where we can really, also support colleagues, and not only students.
And how did this approach come about? Was it led by student need, institutional strategy, or mix of both in this case?
So my understanding is it started out as a school-based project.
Okay.
So at that time, the senior advisor for the school, first for the department, then the school, they led as part of a team on a project. And it was viewed that, strategically, that would be the sort of approach. I think originally it was in light of COVID-19, actually, because there was over-recruitment of students during that time. And they needed to have some additional support in place, because academic colleagues really didn't have the capacity to meet that new influx of students, so almost double the normal number per academic year. So that's how it originated, but now become a firmly embedded model. So since August of 24, it's now become a permanent model in the school. And really, I think the reasoning behind it. So the reason why we don't have, for example, professional advisors across all 3 years following, throughout the programs. One, obviously, resources, which is a key element. And obviously, in the current climate, resources is, becoming much more an issue across many higher education institutions. But also, I think practically from my side as an advisor, I saw that first year students tended to need a bit of greater help and support versus the second and final year students. So I should mention that when the project first started, we actually followed our advisees from their first to their final year, so until graduation. And then it was decided after that it would become a blended model where we just stay with first years. So again, part of the rationale was because there was usually, I think, a skills gap sometimes with first year students. And again, they need a bit more support just to get up to speed. Whereas hopefully a second and third year student has become somewhat familiar with the institution. They might have a better understanding of how things work, especially if we hopefully do our jobs right. Then the second and third year need a little bit less, perhaps less support. Although obviously it's not, that's a generalization. But yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And also to ask, you mentioned you also teaching role. So do you see an overlap? Because as a teacher also, students would directly reach out to you and ask for some advice. So does the professional model sometimes allow advisors to go deeper because they are not carrying all the other expectation attached to teaching roles? Whereas you are sitting in two roles altogether, there might be an overlap in your capacity of your role, I think.
Absolutely. So yes, as I said before, sometimes there can be that positive synergy. So if a student sees me as their, let's say their tutor or lecturer, and then they see me again as their advisor, obviously slightly different hats, so slightly different roles. But you're right, it can allow the space, to delve a bit deeper, to explore. So, as a professional advisor, if you're trying to advise a student academically, let's say looking at their work, looking at their grades, trying to understand their feedback. If, for example, in my case, I've actually marked some papers as part of a particular module, I'm able to give them much greater advice, I think, much more meaningful advice. Because, even in the theory of advising, and there are many different, theoretical lenses, one of them views advising as a form of teaching. And that's why traditionally the model for advising has always been the pastoral one that I mentioned earlier. So, connected purely to academic colleagues, something that academic colleagues do exclusively. So, it's because of that mindset that actually advising is a form of teaching, which I think, holds true. So that's why in my case, I think it works very well because I do teach. I have the teaching and learning aspect alongside the advising. So they're really complementary and help to reinforce each other. Obviously, there can sometimes be potential for conflict of interest.
I was coming to that. In fact, some students particularly might want that I do not want to be advised by my tutor.
Well, there might be a bit of anxiousness around that. You might say, my tutors can see that I've not been paying attention in his class. So.
If you're fine in sharing, are you a better tutor or are you a better advisor?
Well, I'm not sure. I hope I'm good at both.
Oh, that's brilliant. This is what I was expecting from the passion you have shared with us.
Obviously, I don't claim to be perfect because no one is.
Absolutely.
But but I think you can be a good teacher, good educator, and a good advisor. And I think that it's entirely complementary.
I was coming to this thing. Have you come across any student who might have told you you're a better advisor than a teacher?
Not yet, but perhaps.
I know. Don't expect that. I'm sure you can be better at both because both of these things complement each other. And also on that note, I would like to ask you at University of Manchester, do you have advising model that reflects the culture and identity of a particular school or discipline? Or are they copied across in a similar fashion across the institution?
So really, this model is primarily only in the School of Social Sciences.
Okay.
I think the business school as well has some version of it. But generally, it's still the older model, the pastoral, so academic colleagues having that advising role. Actually, there's a review taking place now in light of the Manchester 2035 strategy. So a specific review into academic advising and, perhaps what models should be adopted across the institution. There are some, where it might not be possible to replicate a professional model. So, for example, if you're advising in nursing or midwifery, that might require someone who's actually, trained specifically in that program and field. But for others, more generally, I think the professional model could serve as a blueprint. And interestingly, that actually formed the basis of my postgraduate certificate in higher education that I did here at Manchester. So I discussed and explored the idea of, this SOS model across the school, professional advising, to be a blueprint, maybe for the institution as a whole, as well as perhaps, other institutions as well. Because, now students are expecting a lot more. They're paying such high fees. The fees are ever rising, of course, and students expect a lot more in terms of, support and service. And obviously, this really supports this idea of students as consumers, which is obviously very hotly contested. This marketization, of higher education. But the reality on the ground is students do expect a lot more support than they did perhaps, when I was a student back in 2011. So I think there has been almost a cultural shift in expectations. And perhaps, justifiably so, because the fees have more than trebled since my time.
Yeah, I think you mentioned blueprint, and even a lot of our listeners will probably be thinking that, yes, this model sounds great, but how do we resource it? How do you respond to that concern?
It is a concern, of course, and obviously I'm acutely aware of that. When we gave actually a presentation at the last academic year at UCAT, that was one question which featured prominently. And, it is quite a significant, investment for institutions to make. But I think in the long run, if you do a cost-benefit analysis, if, for example, having that sort of professional model helps to retain students, helps to, give students the best possible student experience while they're with you at the institution, then I think it's a worthwhile investment. So it's really just making the case that, students deserve this type of support. And oftentimes, they actually need it as well. It's not just... students need to, again, to feel as they're part of an institution. So again, fostering that sense of belonging, having a personal one-to-one advisor, I think can help with that process.
I think the investment is certainly worthwhile, but do you think institutions sometimes underestimate the strategic value of advising just because its impact is not always immediately visible?
Absolutely, and I think that's part of the issue, is that how do you measure successful advising and the impact it's having, and that can be a bit more woolly and obviously debatable and contested. But really, I think it's in outcomes at the end. So students who graduate with a good degree outcome, 2-1 or above, usually that becomes quite tangible and visible as a measure. And I think you're right, there has to be that sort of strategic rethinking, if you will. There is a need for a sort of more comprehensive form of support, wraparound support for students.
And if you think a university is listening right now and thinking to this conversation, and they're thinking we need to improve advising, but we do not know where to begin, what is the first honest conversation, in your opinion, they should be having right now?
So I think really they have to take stock of, what their current institutional approach is. So see what the current practices are. Obviously, you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. you keep
Absolutely.
obviously the good elements and take out the less good parts. So I think we're starting from that starting point, at least from a basic review, and
Yeah.
then working your way. You could have it a sort of staff consultative exercise where you consult staff on what sort of model do you think should be in practice or embedded in their institution. You could then also directly consult students through it could be through group sessions or interviews, or there's a whole range of methods that can be used qualitatively to do that. So I think just the starting point would be just to review current processes, work out what can perhaps be reformed. I know obviously there is this trepidation about investment and radical overhaul of a system. So if a university has always done one thing one way, obviously they might be reluctant to say, well, actually we're going to completely change the entire systemic framework. That's quite a radical shift. But they could, tweak things. They, if, for example, if they separate, let's say, academic and pastoral issues, they might want to look at whether that's really feasible, whether that's really, something that students want. Do they want to keep, repeating information to different actors and separating out issues in a very linear way, which I think is, well, to me, it seems questionable that you could do it in that sense. But I know other institutions, they do it. So obviously I'm very open to different perspectives and what they might suggest. But there does actually seem to be a lot of interest, I think, now in professional advising. And interestingly, we've been invited by UCAT to deliver a Tutoring Matters webinar in June. So that will again be similar to what we did in the webinar with yourself a few weeks ago. So yes, so again, to share this sort of practice more widely across the sector.
Yeah, that's good to know, Wayne. And you mentioned that institutions should start with reviewing first. If you think that university leader spends one day shadowing and reviewing advising work, what do you think they would notice most?
So typically, I would say they would notice that whether or not the system at the moment is working or not.
Okay.
So looking at, for example, is there a sort of consistent provision of advising across the school or the department or the institution, because that's really one of the biggest drivers and objectives behind this project at the University of Manchester, is because there was a noticeable inconsistency in the provision of advising. So some academic colleagues were brilliant advisors, meeting their advisees, supporting them, helping them to develop towards their goals, etc. And in other cases, unfortunately, it might be where the advisee has not even met their advisor, across the full 3 years, which is, less than ideal, to put it politely. And so really, trying to assess whether there is sort of consistency in the provision, or whether there's inconsistency. So again, working towards tweaking. If they're not, willing to do a radical overhaul, at least just tweaking around the edges.
Yeah. And where do you think, Wayne, that academic advising is heading over the next few years?
From my own perspective, obviously, I'm speaking now in a more personal capacity. But I think there will be an increasing drive towards the professionalization of advising. You're right, of course. Advising has not really previously been that significant or prominent. As part of, let's say, promotional criteria, or as part of academic contracts. It's mentioned, of course, but there's not really much value, I think, or given to it, or meaning in terms of promotional opportunities. And I think that will change in the future, because again, it's going to revolve much more around the student experience, and students again, are expecting more, and perhaps justifiably so. And so there will need to be, I think, a move towards increasing professionalization. And it doesn't have to be, like in our case, we have a blended model, which I think, again, it aims to bridge divides. So, I have heard in other institutions sometimes there has been a divide between academic colleagues on the one side and professional services colleagues on the other. And that's quite a typical narrative that I've heard. And I think really, in our particular roles, we're really bridging all of them. So we're acting as a point of contact for academic colleagues, we're acting as intermediaries for professional service colleagues, and help, bring them all together in a unified sense. And I think that's really important as well, because, what are universities without their professional services teams? Okay, we have wonderful academics and professors and senior lecturers, etc. Who receive lots of grants and bring in lots of income. But by and large, professional services colleagues, often, they don't get the credit that they might also, deserve, that they do thoroughly deserve. And I think that it's important to recognize, how important they are as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a very valid point. And if someone listening is already doing advising work, but feeling very much overstretched and undervalued, what would you want to say to them?
So I say don't lose hope. Obviously, if you're feeling overworked, and which is often the case in academia, unfortunately, try to influence changes. So you could start locally. Let's say in your department, there could be a local change, a sort of community of practice. You could then expand that to, across the school, if you're part of a school or the faculty. Obviously, try to meet with the key decision makers. Try to, you have to network in that sense to try and influence change, which I think is important. But really, not to lose hope and to keep knocking on the doors that might hopefully lead to some positive change. Even I think sometimes the staff, we feel that our voices might be insignificant in comparison to these very large institutions. But I think at the same time it's also probably an attitudinal thing from our side. We just have to maintain that positive approach as much as possible.
That's very good advice, Wayne. And we are nearly towards the end of our podcast. If you think entire world was listening to this podcast and you could share a single message, and if you had to sum up the true purpose of academic advising in one thought, what would you say to them?
So I think it comes back to the key theme that we have addressed, in this session here today. Essentially, treating people as individuals, making sure their voices are heard and they feel that they're heard. And I think it's a lot easier said than done, of course. But trying to put that motto, if you will, into a practical sense and into our daily practice, whether we're educators, lecturers, advisors, whatever capacity we might hold, but trying to always, do our best for the person in front of us, and not losing sight of the individual.
That's brilliant, Wayne. And before we close, where can listeners find more about your work or get in touch with you for further discussion, or if they want to know more about this advising professional model at University of Manchester?
So I'd be very happy if those listening would love to contact me. So you can contact me via email, wayne.ramwell@manchester.ac.uk. I'm always happy to, network and collaborate with other colleagues across the sector. We are actually part of a professional tutoring network with other universities, and it's a growing network. So if you're interested in that as well, please get in touch. We can always add you to it. And we often hear, insights from different institutions about their approaches and try to share, best practice, a sort of community of practice, like what you've set up, really. So, yeah.
And I'll also share your contact details in our description of our podcast. And that brings us to the end of today's episode of Unfiltered by Empowered. A huge thank you to you, Wayne, for joining us and for sharing such thoughtful and insightful reflection on academic advising and the professional model being developed at University of Manchester. And this has been a really valuable conversation and one that reminds us how important advising is in helping students not only succeed academically, but also grow as a student individually also. And thank you as well to all our listeners for tuning in. I hope today's discussion has offered both practical insights and food for thought on how institution can rethink student support, strengthen their advising cultures, and create more connected and empowering experience in higher education. If you enjoyed the episode, please do subscribe to our channel so you can stay updated with future conversation from Unfiltered by Empowered. Until next time, stay curious, stay reflective, and stay empowered. Thank you.
Thank you very much.